Welcome to another episode of Pirkei Avot. We're on chapter 5 and about to do Mishna 5 in memory of Levy ben Moshe and Elshevayel ben Levy, and also in memory of Binyamin ben Moshe Esther. And here's Michael.
Thanks, Prophet Mashiach. So in this Mishnah we are going to talk about the 10 miracles that were wrought for our forefathers in Egypt. And we're going to discuss them at quite length, and we can analyze them. So let's start with the Mishnah. 10 miracles were wrought for our forefathers in Egypt. Al Hayam, and 10 at the Red Sea. Asa makot heviu hakadosh baruch hu al hamitzrim b'mitzrayim ve'asa al hayam. 10 plagues did HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring upon the Egyptians in Egypt, and 10 at the sea. So interesting, because we're all familiar with the 10 in Egypt, but the 10 at the sea, perhaps we're not so familiar. Perhaps I know I wasn't before I learned this. So I'm going to refer also to the Ethics of Sinai by Irving Bunim. I'm going to read excerpts as he gives an excellent commentary on this, of quite a complex subject. So, the Mishnah first mentions 10 miracles for Bnei Yisrael in Egypt. The Torah describes the 10 plagues for the Egyptians, but not these miracles. Rambam, however, has an answer, and I quote: 10 miracles for our forefathers in Egypt lay in their being spared the 10 plagues. Each plague afflicted only the Egyptians and not the Bnei Israel. For each plague, the Torah specifies that it was visited upon the Egyptians, except for kinim, which is vermin or gnats, which was the third plague, where it is not stated explicitly that it was only visited on the Egyptians. But it is clear that this was not intended to punish the Bnei Israel. Therefore, the kinim were prevalent amongst them, but did not afflict them, as Chazal explains. But for the other plagues, it is specified. So we are assuming that the Bnei Israel was somehow shielded from the effects of the plagues. So therefore, when the waters of Egypt turned into blood, the water in Goshen remained clear. When frogs swarmed over the land of Egypt, none disturbed the homes of the Israelites, and so with the rest of the plagues. So let's give a breakdown of the 10 plagues at the Red Sea. This Mishnah doesn't describe them, but the Avot to Rav Nassan, which is like a parallel Pirkei Avot, does give a complete listing, and I'm going to go through 10 now. So the first miracle was when our forefathers stood at the Red Sea. Moshe Rabbeinu told them, "Arise and go across." And they replied, "We cannot cross until the sea shall become filled with tunnels." So Moses took his staff and struck the water, whereupon it became full of tunnels. And the second miracle that Avot Rav Natan lists is, Moshe said to Bnei Israel, "Arise and go across." And they replied, "We cannot until the sea is turned into a valley before us." And Moshe Rabbeinu took his staff and struck the water, and it turned into a valley before them. What was the third miracle that occurred at the Red Sea? Moshe said, "Arise and go across" to Bnei Israel, and they replied, "We cannot cross until it is sundered into rills before us." Moses took his staff and struck the water, and it was sundered into rills.
Tunnels, that means separate channels.
Channels. And the fourth miracle that occurred at the Red Sea, Moshe told Bnei Israel, "Arise and go across the water, go across," and they replied, "We cannot until it is turned into clay before us." Again, Moses took his staff and it turned into clay. The fifth miracle that occurred at the Red Sea, Moses said, "Arise and go across." And they replied, "We cannot cross until it was made a wilderness before us." So again, Moshe took his staff and it became a wilderness. So the Bnei Israel were understandably terrified. They got the Egyptians storming them in the distance. They got the sea that has parted, not knowing how long it would part for. And not knowing the it could be quicksand. In fact, it could have seemed like quicksand in front of them. Let's look at the sixth miracle that occurred. Moshe said, "Arise and go across," and they replied, "We cannot until it has crumbled before us." And Moshe again took his staff and performed the miracle, and it was crumbled before them. Seventh miracle that occurred, Moshe said, "Arise and go across," and they replied, "We cannot until it has turned into rocks before us." And Moshe took his staff and struck the water, and it turned into rock. The eighth miracle that occurred, Moshe said, "Arise and go across." They replied, "We cannot go until it is made into dry land before us." Again, Moshe took his staff, performed a miracle, and the dry land appeared before them. The ninth, Moses again bid them to go across. They replied, "We cannot until it becomes walls before us to pass from them." Again, Moshe took his staff and it became walls. Again, the 10th and final miracle to occur, he bid them to go across. They replied, "We cannot until it becomes like leather water bags, kind of, I guess, like leather sandbags." Moses took his staff and struck the water, and it became like leather water bags. Then whatever water remained between the sundered paths, fire descended and licked it dry, and from the water bags flowed oil and honey into the mouths of babes for them to suckle. Some say that fresh water flowed from the sea for them within the sundered paths, since sea water is salty, and the clouds of glory were above them, that the sun should not be overpowering, and thus Bnei Israel crossed it, so they did not suffer any discomfort.
In fact, there's a list of 50 miracles that occurred. Among them where the floor was like glass and the walls of water on the side, you could put a cup in them and fresh water would come out. There was trees or something with fruits or vegetables or whatever. It's literally listed 50 miracles.
Yeah. So Avot Rav Nassan also comments on the Bnei Israel. They were obviously terrified. There perhaps are people being difficult. You can see all these kind of requests: do this, do that, do that. But you have to put yourself in their shoes. They were terrified of what would happen. This is not something they even expected as they approached the sea. They weren't like told, "We're heading towards the sea. It's going to be separated for us." Everything was happening there and then, and with the background of the Egyptians storming them. So perhaps they were stubborn and demanding to see change after change before they would trust Moshe and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the sea waters would not come rushing back when they were crossing onto dry land. But behind their demands there lay insecurity and fear. They were simply like frightened children. So every demand that they make was accepted and granted. As Avot the Rav Nassan explains elsewhere, and I quote, "To make known how beloved to HaKadosh Baruch Hu were Bnei Israel." The Midrash has a different tradition of 10 miracles at the Red Sea. I'll list them now. Number 1, the sea divided and the waters formed a kind of vaulted arch, like an overhead arch. Number 2, it divided into 12 sections, leaving 12 paths, one for each tribe. Number 3, the land became completely dry for Bnei Israel to walk across. Number 4, but it turned to clay afterwards for the Egyptians. Number 5, it crumbled into little pieces for the Israelites. Number 6, for the pursuing Egyptians, however, it turned into a resemblance of rocks, against which their heads were smashed.
Wow.
Number 7, it piled up into huge mounds. Number 8, finally forming an enormous heap. Number 9, a flowing source provided sweet drinking water amidst the salty water. Number 10, once they had drunk their fill, the water congealed and became as glass, through which they could see one another.
Through all the 12 channels.
Yeah. So, there were also elements of the Bnei Israel that had different thoughts about what was going on. Apparently, I think there were 4 groups. The 4 groups spoke up with different views. So the first group said, "Let us jump into the water," preferring drowning to slavery back in Egypt. The second group shouted, "Let us return to Egypt. Better to be living slaves than corpses." The third group shouted, "Let us give battle." They were ready to fight the Egyptians. Perhaps they would prefer to die fighting than risk everything. The fourth proposed, "Let us shout and howl against them." This is very interesting. This was an ancient battle tactic, that the shouting would be a precursor to the battle, and sometimes it was enough to frighten the enemy away. And they thought that this was something that they could use. So let's see what happened to the various people. What was Moshe's response to these 4 groups? The ones who said, "Let us jump into the sea," Moshe replied, "Stand firm and see the salvation of Hashem." This we see in Shemot 14:13. To those who proposed, "Let us return to Egypt," he said, "You shall see them again no more and ever." Again from Shemot. To the group that explained, "Let us give battle," he replied, "The Lord will fight for you." Again we see this in chapter 14 of Shemot. And those who insisted, "Let us shout and howl against them," he said, "And do you be still," urging them to have faith in God. So we can only conclude that for them the miracles came to engender or bring out a faith in Hashem, since they were destined to receive the Torah, and they needed this preparation or this process to actually shock treatment into realizing you've got to start believing in God. And this could all have been preparation for their belief.
Well, it says after they came out, they said, "Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo."
Yeah, and if people said they feared Hashem and they believed in Hashem and His servant Moshe. Exactly, yeah. So after these 10 miracles at the shores of the Red Sea, and in the Red Sea, they all believed. Let us analyze what is a nes, what is a miracle, and what are the different categories that, as I understand, there are 3 levels of a miracle. There is the teva, which can be considered a part of nature, a normal condition of nature. Peleh, which is a more advanced form of nature, or more unusual, exceptional, which perhaps a tidal wave or a comet. They have natural explanations. And Nes is the highest, which is something that seems to be beyond the laws of nature. But if we look at actually what happened, we understand that the wind was the thing that drove back. It says in Shemot 14:21, the wind drove the Red Sea back. Hashem drove the Red Sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. So this was the Bnei Israel, even though this wasn't like this could be explained naturally, but to everybody there, the timing and the events had to be considered, especially with everything that was going on, escaping from Egypt, fleeing from Egypt, and this wind that came up that separates it. Even though some detractors could say this is a natural event, it's just wind, everybody there saw the hand of God. And even though it was the laws of nature that were the kind of forces that Hashem used to create this nest, but it was still a nest, and it was actually an elevation of perception and belief that Bnei Israel had. They knew that this was a miracle. They knew this was being done specifically for them at that time and for their escape. So let's look at what it says in the Mishnah when it says 10 plagues did HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring upon Egyptians in Egypt and 10 at the sea. So let's look at these 10 plagues at sea. Or what is this? Well, as we know, the 10 plagues in Egypt don't need any explanation. We read them in the Seder and Pesach, they're in the Haggadah, but Tanakh tells of no 10 plagues at the Red Sea. But the Avot, the Rav Natan, he describes them, or they describe them as 10 forms of death that the Egyptians suffered, indicated by passages in the Shirah, the great composition that Moshe Rabbeinu and the Bnei Israel sang afterwards. So let's go through them. Number 1, the horse and his rider, HaKadosh Baruch Hu threw into the sea. Number 2, Pharaoh's chariot and his legion, HaKadosh Baruch Hu cast into the sea. All of this is mentioned in Shemot. Number 3, and his picked officers are sunk into the Red Sea. But these are Pharaoh's picked officers. Number 4, the deep ocean covers them. Number 5, they went down into the depths like a stone. They sank like a rock. Number 6, and I quote, "Thy right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy." So this must have been absolute devastation for these Egyptians. They were getting smashed by Hashem. Number 7, and I quote, this is from Shira, "Thou dost overthrow thy adversaries." This is from Shemot again. Number 8, "Thou dost send forth thy fury, it consumes them as stubble." And number 9, "The waters piled up and the floods stood upright as a heap," i.e. the waters became like a great heap, like a mound, which would smash the heads of the Egyptians. And number 10, they sank as lead. So in Pesach, the Haggadah gives us views which differ from our Mishnah, as Rabbi Yosef Haglili says, "How do we learn that while the Egyptians suffered 10 plagues in Egypt, at the Red Sea they suffered 50 plagues? Of the plagues in Egypt, what is stated?" And I quote, "And the magician said to Pharaoh, 'This is the finger of God.' But in regard to the Red Sea, what is stated? Bnei Israel saw that the great hand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wielded against the Egyptians." How much did they suffer through the finger, so to speak? 10 plagues. Therefore, you learn that in Egypt they suffered 10 plagues, and at the sea 50. A hand has 5 fingers, symbolizing punishment 5 times as great. A little reflection will bear out Rabbi Yosef Aglili's basic point. At the Red Sea, the Egyptians were punished far more severely than in Egypt. In Egypt, water turned into blood. At the sea, the Egyptians' blood spilled into the water. On land, the Egyptians were beset by frogs. In the sea, their flesh was devoured by all the creatures of the deep. In Egypt, the firstborn was slain, and in the sea, all pursuing Egyptians were destroyed. As the Haggadah continues, Rabbi Eliezer establishes that every single plague was really a composite of 4 plagues in one. Therefore, he changes Rabbi Yosef's figures of 40 plagues in Egypt and 200 at the sea. Rabbi Akiva's view follows that each plague was really 5 in one. Therefore, 50 plagues came to Egypt and 250 afflicted the pursuers at the Red Sea. So a question can be asked, therefore, what benefit is there to ascertain that both in Egypt and at the Red Sea the Egyptians suffered this multitude of afflictions and troubles? The Vilna Gaon gives an answer. Soon after they left the Red Sea, the Bnei Israel received an everlasting promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I quote, "If you will diligently hearken to the voice of Hashem your God and do his statutes, none of the diseases or afflictions which I put on the Egyptians will I put on you, for I am the Lord that heals you." End quote. Years later, Moshe Rabbeinu affirmed it. And I quote, "None of the evil afflictions of Egypt which you knew will HaKadosh Baruch Hu inflict on you? This we learn in Shemot 15:26 and Devarim 7:15 is mentioned. How well it pays then to explore carefully the full extent and variety of plagues that the Egyptians suffered. The more we learn about these makot, the more we know of the divine immunity and guarantee of health that can be ours through the observance of Torah and its mitzvot. Lastly, in conclusion, let's look at the book of Kuzari. They note that HaKadosh Baruch Hu began the Ten Commandments, the blazing, overwhelming charge from Sinai for all eternity. And I quote, I am HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. From Exodus, he did not begin, I am the creator of the world and your creator. As their liberator from cruel slavery and terrifying enemy, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was known to the Israelites in their immediate experience. On such knowledge could they live in faith. God, as a creator, was abstract, general concept that would have moved them, not really have moved them to such belief and fervor. They were affected more by the immediate events that preceded that happened after they left Egypt. This was utterly unquestionable to them. So, in turn, we celebrate the Seder at Passover every year to retell and relive the liberation from the Egyptians, so that it may become embedded to us as a solid foundation for our faith. Even at Rosh Hashanah, this traditional anniversary of creation, we don't have a Seder to recount the glories of creation. Rather, in the Shema, we recite it every morning and evening. The third paragraph concludes, I am the Lord your God who has brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. And for this reason, at the Seder, we are commanded to dwell on every detail, to tell and retell at the greatest length the liberation from Egypt. So that concludes this Mishna 5 of Perek 5. And
wow, that's literally a mission of biblical proportions. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. And we look forward to next week, or next time we convene, there's Zat Hashem, when we're going to be talking about the 10 trials which our ancestors tested Hashem with. Okay, and until then, we wish you a wonderful and blessed week.